Ladies and gentlemen, let's get into the video. We have an Nvidia double bill. So first of all, we're going to talk about the GTX 1080, the mobile version, just to be clear, and then we're going to mosey on over to the GTX 1060, which this time will be the desktop version. So it must be said that the 1080 for desktop is pretty darn impressive in terms of performance. So how is it going to be for mobile? Well, we don't have official benchmarks yet, at least all of them, but ASUS have provided us some glimpse as to what the card is capable of. And the GXXX, as it's being touted on the ASUS website, is managing to pip the GTX Titan X to the post in terms of raw performance on 3D Mark 11. I just want that to sink in. It's getting 20,811 P score, which is completely ludicrous for a mobile part. Absolutely nuts. Unfortunately, we don't know whether we're going to see fewer CUDA cores or perhaps lower memory clocks for the mobile version of the processor. Regardless, even if you say that there's lower core clocks, or once again fewer CUDA cores or what have you to fit into a lower TDP for once again make it more usable for mobile platforms, it's still incredibly impressive. This level of performance is available on a laptop, and it shows once again that the next generation of GPUs is going to be something to remember. Keeping with Camp Green for a moment, I do want to talk about the GeForce GTX 1060. There is some ambiguity whether it's the 1060 or 1060 Ti, but this card is looking to be pretty darn impressive. So, just for the sake of clarification, the GTX 1070 and 1080 are utilizing the same core. It's using the GP104. We've been through this several times over, of course. Essentially, the GP104 has certain cores disabled, certain CUDA cores, and that will make it the 1070. And if all of the processors are enabled, that's of course the full desktop part, which is the 1080. The GP106 is going to be found in the GTX 1060. Now we're not quite sure whether it's the 1060 or the 1060 Ti. Tis typically, of course, do have higher clock speeds, maybe higher amounts of memory bandwidth, or perhaps more CUDA cores, but the shipping manifests have definitely indicated that we're looking at a 256-bit memory bus, and yes, we're seeing GDDR5 memory. Unfortunately, we don't know the exact specifications of the GP106. There have been some leaked die shots and a few other bits and bobs scattered around the internet, some of it courtesy of video cards, and it would appear that the die size is around 200 mm squared, so we can perhaps expect the number of CUDA cores to be around the 1280 mark. That would make sense, and it seems to be the number often touted by folks in the industry. Now, this should be pretty damn impressive, because it doesn't really take much to do some simple mathematics. You could simply take 1280, times it by 2, because once again the simple way of explaining it is 2 operations per clock, and then times it by the rough speed of the GTX 1070 or the 1080. Let's, for conservativeness, say it's around 1600, which means that the GTX 1060 or 1060 Ti, we're unsure which, is going to have a rough floating point performance of around 4 TFLOPS, which is not shabby. That's pretty darn good. And should mean for folks who are looking for an entry-level Pascal card, for folks who are looking for, say, 1080p, it's a pretty darn good buy. Obviously, most of this will come down to how competitive they are against Polaris, because if AMD manage to compete on price, for example, they have better performance for the same price, or what have you, then your money is, well, up to you how you want to spend it. From what we understand, it will obviously still require a power connector, and most of the reason behind this is because of overclocking headroom. From what I've heard about the GTX 1070 and 1080 overclocking, particularly the 1080 because there's a lot more information about the 1080, there be the problem with overclocking primarily down to the power limits of the card. Essentially, because you've only got the one power connector, you can only suck a certain amount of energy into the GPU. And so what happens is once you start pushing the power limits up, cards aren't able to overclock enough. Essentially, you're just not running into heat issues. You're instead running into power issues. You can't deliver enough power to the GPU core before their headroom simply runs out. So theoretically, if this comes with a 6 or an 8 pin power connection, then you should get pretty darn good overclocks, and it might be the case where the 1060 Ti actually overclocks like an absolute demon. For example, it could overclock, let's assume that the regular clock speed is about 1600 megahertz. It could overclock to like 2 gigahertz or 2.1 with sufficient cooling. But obviously some of this may be limited by Nvidia with a certain BIOS, but as we all know, some folks are going to be really happy to modify that BIOS and remove the power constraints, which is something I've done before with cards. For example, the GTX the 780 Ti, I've removed the power limits on one of the 780 Tis that we've got available, and it means that basically the only limit then is the power consumption of the board total and heat, rather than an artificial limitation that the BIOS of the GPU places upon it. Really, it comes down to pricing on how interesting this card is going to be, and how, of course, once again, it stacks up with Polaris. From what we've heard about the pricing of Polaris and the market positioning of Polaris, more specifically Polaris 10, realistically, Nvidia can't go much above the 300 mark. And because of the components of the GPU and the performance of the 1060 or 1060 Ti, which we can base upon this rumor or these rumors, they also really don't want to go below, let's say, to $30 to $40 US, and frankly, I'd be shocked if it went that low. Obviously, some of their partners might decide to reduce or have cost-reduced versions of the board. Some, for example, might decide to have more expensive versions of the board, maybe with subtle overclocks. It really comes down to what you manage to get, and obviously there are going to be some rebates in there as well. It should be quite cool, and it should also add quite an increase over the GTX 960, because the problem with the 960 really came down to the memory bus. It helped a lot that Maxwell did have much better color compression over Kepler, but obviously Pascal A has more memory bandwidth period, and B has better color compression anyway. So theoretically speaking, that plus a larger number of CUDA cores plus higher clocks period, plus being more efficient as an architecture, it should be a really nice GPU. What's the performance going to be, I hear you scream? Well, unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see it over the 970 performance. Obviously, once again, it does really come down to the clock speeds. Nvidia might decide to be ultra conservative with the clocks. So for example, they might decide, we don't really want to go more about, above, let's say 1200 or 1250, in which case that's really going to smack the raw performance upside the noggin. They might, though, decide, hey, you know, let's just go up to 14, 15, 1600 megahertz, in which case it's going to be really, really powerful, and it theoretically might make the GTX 1070 a little weird, actually, in the market. It really comes down to the pricing. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video and my rambling. As usual, if you want to do the likey, subscribey, commenty, sharey thing, that would be certainly appreciated. But for now, I bid thee farewell. Bye for now. I don't know why I said that ending. That was a bit weird. It's going to be one of those days. Alright, anyway, bye for now.